Good day. Yeah, I was just listening to a new album that came out about a week and a half ago by the Rolling Stones, my favorite band, and the album actually was recorded in 1977 in a club in Toronto, Canada. The album's called El Macambo, and here I am listening to it in 2022. It is just remixed and re-released and distributed on new platforms that weren't available in 1977. And it speaks to how amazing sound recording is today because of mass media. And it's what our subject is all about today as we take on Chapter 6. We're taking on the second third of the course, so to speak. We finished one third as we head into this Monday week. So let's talk about audio today. Today, the tools of media allow anybody to create music and to distribute it. That means many people in this class probably are musicians, and you already have a YouTube channel, and you've been performing and distributing your music. Doesn't mean that you can get to a lot of people, but it's possible today. Whereas in 1977, if you were a band, you had to have a producer, you had to have equipment, you had to have a studio, you had to have a record company signing you. You couldn't be like Justin Bieber and just do a bunch of YouTube videos and become famous. So the industry has changed quite a bit today. Now let's talk about the history of sound recording to find out where it all started. And it starts, as we always know, with inventions that lead to new ways of people communicating. And we just want to make the point that before there was sound recording, before you could record music, music could only be distributed live. If you want to hear a piano player, you have to go to where the piano player is playing, especially a piano that can't be taken around. If you want to hear a violin player, yeah, you can listen to a violin player wherever they take their violin, but you have to go hear the music live. And so that required teaching music. It required music sheets and scores so that you could pass the songs around. But really, there was no option to transport music after it had already been recorded. This, of course, all changes with Thomas Edison. We're now introducing another inventor that was going to appear regularly in a couple lectures for us. Thomas Edison, the famous inventor. He's known as the most famous inventor in the United States. He actually has a national park just outside of New York City called the Thomas Edison National Park. If you get interested in what you hear about him in this class, it might make a nice summer day for you. So Thomas Edison in 1877, he invented this contraption that was called a phonograph. And it was basically like an aluminum foil cylinder, if you want to think of it that way, with a needle that went across the top. And that was his way of recording music, of storing music and playing it back. It was, in essence, converting a mechanical signal stored in the foil into an electrical signal and then amplifying it. His very first song, Thomas Edison, that he recorded and played back was Mary Had a Little Lamb. And actually, Thomas Edison invented this thing more for courts so that dictation could take place and people could record testimony. And then it just became something that naturally lended itself to music. It took him 10 months to come up with that invention, by the way. After that, as is often the case, another inventor comes along and improves the invention, and that would be Emile Berliner. That's his name, Berliner, just like the city in Germany, and he actually was from Germany. And he developed something called a gramophone. A gramophone, which is the same idea as Thomas Edison, but instead of a foil cylinder spinning around, he had a disc that went around and around and around, using flat discs. And basically the material on those discs was zinc, and it allowed for a much better mastering, if you know that process in sound production. It allowed for a much better mastering of the music. But eventually everybody just came to refer to this invention as the phonograph, as the gramophone and the phonograph together, both Edison's and Berliner's technologies together. Some other key points in the development of sound technology would include 1935, when high fidelity was introduced, or hi-fi, which should sound to you like Wi-Fi, right? Wireless fidelity. That's where that word is coming from. And in this case, it was high fidelity. And basically what that it did was it allowed the recording process to be able to distribute high ends and low ends in music as opposed to just the middle range. If you're a musician, you sort of know what I'm talking about. Basically, because of high fidelity, we could hear, when we listen to playback of music, we could hear bass now and we could hear treble now much more clearly than past recording techniques soon after Thomas and Edison and Emile Berliner, where you had a mono and a very mid-range sound. And then in 1948, we get yet another development. 1948 saw the invention of magnetic tapes. Magnetic tapes allowed for better sound recording because you could record and then you could come back and record over what you've recorded. So if you didn't like your first take, for example, you know what a take is in the studio, take 1, take 2, take 3, you could come back and get rid of it and record over it, as opposed to having to etch in zinc on an album for the first time. And if it's no good, it's like a clay tablet, right? Got to throw it out and start all over again. It took so long to create it. So magnetic tapes eventually showed themselves in the form of cassette tapes and reel-to-reel tapes, and it just changed the way that recording was done. Because not only could you record over the music, but you could also record one layer. You could record just the drums, for example, and then come back and you could come back and record the bass over that. Then you can come back over that and record the vocals and then other instruments. So that's called multi-tracking. We'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, so we have music being developed, but we don't yet have the transmission of music. And that is going to accelerate the mass communication of music as well. And that starts to happen in 1844. And it happens with an invention called the telegraph. So the telegraph was a stapler-looking device where you could tap on it with dots and dashes. That's the sounds, dots and dashes. And it used Morse code because Samuel Morse was in the army and he developed this language of dots and dashes to be able to communicate by telegraph. Pretty cool, huh? We do the same thing today with emojis and acronyms like LOL. It's the same idea. It's creating a new language with the communication medium that's available. So Sam Morse invented this, and then the telegraph became very useful to the United States. They laid a cable all the way across Europe and used the telegraph later to establish telegraph communication with Europe. However, telegraph wires could be cut. So that was a problem in wartime. It made telegraph wires or communication susceptible to espionage. Along comes Heinrich Hertz, therefore, another German, Heinrich Hertz. You may recognize his last name there because we use that name to describe the units of voltage, like gigahertz. That's coming from his name, Heinrich Hertz. In 1888, he started to develop, get this, theories of radio transmission. Theories, like on a drawing board, like some people are doing right now with holograms, or trying to invent a time machine, sending people into the past or into the future. It's all theory by physicists on boards, and that's what Heinrich Hertz did. And his theory was about that you could send a radio signal through the air without using cable. And it took another person, though, to put that theory into practice, and that would be Guglielmo Marconi, an Italian Guglielmo Marconi, in 1894, and he created what was known at the time as the wireless telegraph. So that was a telegraph without wires, just like we have Wi-Fi on our phones, right? So a lot of mass communication terminologies, they aren't in fact new. They're borrowing from older generations of technologies, just like hi-fi and Wi-Fi and wireless. Those are three terms that are as current today as they ever were. But still, we don't have the ability to send voice over the airways. That requires a whole different engineering accomplishment. And for that, another person comes along, and his name is Reginald Fezenden. He's an American. It's in 1901 we're talking about now, and he figured out how to send voice signals electronically through the air. So now we have everything in the place, basically, for the radio medium and for popular music, and really for music distribution in general. We've got the ability to record, we've got the ability to transmit, and we've got the ability to transmit without needing wires. Now, I'd like to mention another historical figure. His name is David Sarnoff. David Sarnoff was actually a Navy specialist on board the Carpathia ship, which was right next to the Titanic as it was sinking. And David Sarnoff was radioing, using a radio to send signals back to New York, radioing for hospital assistance, for supplies, for blankets, so that when the survivors got back there, they would be treated with the proper health attention. But he also used that knowledge then to go to work for, of all companies, he started to go work for the Marconi company. Marconi started a company in audio signals. And in that company as an executive, he wrote what's known as the famous Music Box Memo. That's what David Sarnoff wrote, the Music Box Memo. And in this memo, he was describing radio as a medium that should not be point to point, like between a person on a ship and a person in a port. That's how it was used. But it should be used as a mass distribution device. And in his memo, he described it as he wanted to make radio a household utility. A household utility, so that every house would have a radio receiver, just like every house has electricity and water and plumbing and sewer service. Those are utilities, right? And we consider internet service a utility today. So Sarnoff really is the first one to make radio, get this, a social medium. Radio is perhaps the very first social medium. It's social media, radio, because many people would listen to it at the same time. And that's how listening is still done today. Unless you're alone, you listen together. It's something you can do together as you're working on the yard or at the workplace. So now let's start to talk about the rise of businesses. The first one is going to be the RCA company, which stands for Radio Corporation of America. Many of you will have television sets in your home right now that are RCA sets. These are that's the original company, RCA, Radio Corporation of America. So this company started to develop patents for all this technology that's required to transmit a radio signal. And let me tell you, as an advisor to a radio station at East Stroudsburg University, there's an incredible technological infrastructure that's required. You need a transmitter, you need an antenna, you need a studio, you need emergency alert system equipment, you need playback devices, you need an engineer who can put all this stuff together, and there's a whole lot more than that. So RCA started to become a big company, but unfortunately, World War II got in the way. And during World War II, the Navy and the U.S. government was very concerned about enemies stealing radio patents and then having superior communications, so they suspended all the patents. And nobody could advance radio until RCA came along, because RCA was formed out of GE, General Electric, AT&T, Westinghouse, and the United Fruit Company, and it was created so that the government would no longer control radio and it could be handed off to an assortment of companies that would have radio and America's best interests in mind. So that now leads us to another first in the history of broadcasting, another first that takes place in Pennsylvania, and that is the very first radio station. The very first radio station was KDKA from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it made its first broadcast in 1920. Essentially, the Westinghouse Company, which owned this radio station, said, it didn't own the radio station at the time, but it owned a building, and it said we should put a transmitter on the highest building in the city and broadcast the election returns of Harding versus Cox, the presidential election in 1920. The idea was, if we send the signal out, like throw it out there, like spreading it, then more people can receive it than just one-to-one. So there we have the very first radio station right here in Pennsylvania. By 1923, there were 600 radio transmitters that were broadcasting, so this technology had started to spread. Among the people who were investing in this new media technology was William Paley. We've mentioned him before. He had a cigar company, and he formed a whole entire radio network called the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS as you know it today. In other words, CBS is in 60 Minutes CBS. That's that company. It was a cigar advertising company, and then that company, CBS, got more into just traditional radio programming. There were other networks as well in the history of the U.S. We've got the NBC network, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in the class, and also ABC. Those are the three big radio networks that started early and then made their transition over to television. All right, speaking of television, we do want to talk now about television because television comes on the scene not too far after radio. Remember, going back to our early parts of the class, 40,000 years ago is when humans developed speech. 35,000 years ago, we started to develop the alphabet. In 1920, we have radio developed. In the 1940s, we have television developed. That's a span of 20 years. Look how fast technology and the invention of technology is accelerating. So in the 1940s, we have radio coming on the scene, and it threatened radio, which was in a golden age. Yeah, radio's golden age was the 1920s until the 1940s. And what I mean by the golden age is you can find all kinds of prime time popular programming on radio that you won't see anymore because it's gone over to television. But in those days, in the 20s and the 30s, on radio you could hear westerns, you could hear science fiction, you could hear variety shows, comedy shows, sport shows, news programs. You could hear basically every kind of programming there was, you could hear on radio, and all the best actors. They had left vaudeville, live performances in New York, and they had gone over to radio. But then that all changes. That all changes when television comes onto the scene. The advertisers move over to TV. The best talent in radio moves over to TV. So radio was actually given up for dead in the 1950s. People were like, this is a dead medium. It's not going to do anything anymore because of television. They were wrong. They were wrong because in the 1960s, radio reinvented itself as a niche formatted music distribution outlet. A niche formatted music distribution outlet, meaning instead of radio trying to do all these different kinds of content, Western, sci-fi, soap operas, etc., instead radio would just focus on a narrow format like pop music, or like rhythm and blues, or like country music, or like news, or like sports. These are specific niche formats, and it's really paved the way for radio to continue its success. And there are advantages of radio that other media do not have, and that's why radio will not be going away. The chief one of which, of course, is people are driving cars all the time in the United States. That's our way of life. And so what better place to have a radio than a car? And many people are going to continue to listen to radio just because they want to get out of their boredom. They want to know what the traffic's like. They want to know if there's any major news while they're sitting there in their car. Another reason that radio is going to be around is because it's a companion medium. We tend to have a personal feeling and association with radio that makes it more intimate to us. And when we listen to radio personalities, we tend to feel like we get to know them. You know what I'm talking about if you're a radio listener. Accelerating radio as a companion medium was an invention that came out in 1979. It swept all over college campuses. When I got to college in 1980, everybody had one, just like everybody today has a cell phone. But in 1979 and right after that, it was the Walkman. The Walkman was a device that would take a cassette tape. You put your cassette tape in. It was only about this big, like a wallet size. You put it in your pocket, and then you can listen to music on your headphones. Many people heralded that invention as the end of socialization of people, because for the first time, people walking across college campuses, for example, were not looking at each other and saying hi. They were buried in the music of their phones, and we still see that today, but it's different. It's with cell phones. Now the eyes are buried in the phone instead of the ears. So now what we start to get is music, youth culture, and society all coming together in the 1960s. Youth culture was a bunch of pent-up demands that were repressed, you can say, by a kind of 1950s value system where everybody was supposed to grow up in a middle-class household and have an outdoor barbecue and 2 kids and have clean-cut hair, and the woman was in the house. That all got shattered in the 60s as youth rebelled against that. That's why the 60s, the hippie generation, the Peach generation became so powerful, because of that pent-up demand, and the Vietnam War and other incidents also helped unleash that demand, but so did radio. Radio, and in particular a form of music, rock and roll. Rock and roll, which was a collection of country music, rhythm and blues music, gospel music, and then the electrification of the guitar. That's what started to push rock and roll. We teach a class at ESU in this, by the way, called Pop Music as Cultural Text, CMST 342, if you're interested in that. Now let's address some racism that was occurring, and it is still in the process of being overcome, and that is before 1948, recordings by black musicians, and there were many black musicians, especially along the Mississippi River down through New Orleans, Tennessee and Memphis, and Chicago, all down the Mississippi. A lot of black musicians such as Muddy Waters, etc. Those musicians, if they recorded records, they were referred to as race records. They were referred to as race records, and they were not played on radio because the musicians were black. So racism in the very beginning stifled black artists from getting their music into this brand new mass medium, even though they were very prolific in playing music live and locally. Nonetheless, rhythm and blues became very popular around the country. It's an intoxicating kind of music if you listen to it. It was actually born in the cotton fields by slaves, singing between each other, trying to get through the day, trying to build up morale. The music has so much salt of the earth to it and real people's struggles, but the music itself, that just the chord progression is really amazing to listen to, and the way the chords resolve itself. So we start to get performers that are trying to break through. We've got Winoni Harris. In 1947, he recorded Good Rockin' Tonight. You can check out that song. And that song became a big hit on black jukeboxes. That's right, there were jukeboxes with just black music and stores segregated jukeboxes. Can you believe that? And then later, his music started to sneak through on radio stations, but still the public was not willing to accept, because the radio industry was perpetuating the racism, we're not able to accept black artists as widely as we do today, like Kanye and others. And so what happened was the record labels went looking for an artist who would be acceptable, who could sing black music. You know who that was? It was Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was a white guy, and he made black music acceptable. He didn't even write his own music, Elvis Presley. He just played other people's music. But alongside Elvis Presley was a black musician who did become popular just by sheer demand in and of itself because he was so good. I'm talking about Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry, a black guitarist, broke through and started to get black music and rock and roll on radio. Now let's talk about the changing face of popular music and how it's changed over the years. We're going to pick up with the theme talking about African-American artists with Motown now. So Motown Records was originally founded in Detroit by an African-American named Berry Gordy, and he wanted to have blacks performing black written music. And so some of his very famous artists include Marvin Gaye and the Supremes. Yeah, that's all out of this time period. So Motown became very popular, but it didn't have a hard enough edge for a lot of people who like to listen to that electric guitar, that solid body guitar that was invented. And so next up we have a kind of an invasion from Britain that took place. It's called the British Invasion. And this is where waves of UK bands, British bands, emphasizing a lot of guitar, a lot of lead guitar, a lot of rhythm guitar, a lot of screaming vocals, etc. Rolling Stones are in this mix as well, though not as much as a lot of them. Bands like the Beatles, the Stones I've already mentioned, the Hollies, the Who, Led Zeppelin. This was the British Invasion. At the same time, bands started to produce live shows. Prior to the invention of electronic equipment, if you played live, you could only play to people who were within ear distance of your instruments. So if you're playing an acoustic guitar, then how far away can people sit and still be able to hear you? Not very far. But that all changes with amplifiers and recording techniques and mixing boards. And now performers can play using monitors, using stacked monitors. They can play to people today all the way on the other side of a stadium. And so you start to have the growth of the live performance in rock and roll music in particular being just as important as the music itself, the costuming, the effects that they have on stage, pyrotechniques that Motley Crue and others used. This is all coming about because of live performances. At the same time, we also have the growth of producers in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. Producers are people that could put together the right songs. They could hire songwriters. They could bring in technicians and performers. I'm going to see Aerosmith play live in Las Vegas in September. I'm actually going to be on the stage with them. They sell seats on the stage, if you can believe that. And there was a time period where they couldn't come up with their own material, so they hired outside songwriters, but they did that through a producer. So producers like Rick Rubin, they started to insert themselves, maybe that's too strong of a word, into the recording process, into performers like Johnny Cash, Whitney Houston, Nine Inch Nails, Kanye, Jay-Z, Lady Gaga, Ed Sheeran, all very much managed by producers. Now I'd like to highlight a technology that came about in the 1970s, and stereo was invented in the 1970s, and that split music between two channels, between the left channel and the right channel. And it's amazing, is it not, that when you listen to music that is played by stereo, your brain puts that music back together in your head. You don't just listen to one channel. If you listen to one channel, you may hear one guitar that's not on another channel, but when that sound converges in your head, it has a power and a fullness that had not been possible before stereo. Okay, so next together, we start to have the producer inventing or developing not only the music, but also lifestyle interests that come into music. And so the producers start to promote gay lifestyle, for example, with disco in the 1970s. And right up until today with hip hop, you can find clothing and accessories and bling all being associated with music. Music is much more than just music today. Speaking of hip hop, which we're kind of mentioning here, that brought together DJing, dancing, rapping, and art. All those four things together: dancing, rapping, art, and disc jockeying. And it began, some say hip hop began in the Bronx in 1974 with DJ Kook. And DJ Kook is credited for inventing the breakbeat on the streets of Harlem, where people, looking for a place to express themselves, sometimes politically, but oftentimes just musically, they came out on the streets and invented this new form of music, which includes emceeing like an MC for an event. And that's where you're speaking a word over music, or rapping. That's what rap is. Not that it hadn't been done ever in rock and roll, but it became the primary focus of hip hop. And of course, you have dancing and body movement, and then you have the artistic side, which can include graffiti and can include fashion itself. Now let's talk about country music. Country music was born in the early 1900s, and it comes from Irish and Scottish music and the Appalachian Mountains in the United States for the most part, for example, West Virginia. And so you have a lot of hillbilly sound. That's what it was also known as. Mississippi blues was also coming around and blending with country music. And all of this together, Mississippi blues, Christian gospel, hillbilly music, all came together in what's known today as the Nashville Sound. The Nashville Sound, Nashville, Tennessee. And out of that sound came famous artists like Jimmy Reeves, Eddie Arnold, and Patsy Cline. Later, bigger artists came out like Johnny Cash, Hank Williams, and Merle Haggard. Of course, today you have a lot of crossover artists because country music, when it was influenced by MTV and the visual part of MTV because of music videos, country music then started to really look for good-looking stars. And that's when you start to get buff performers like Garth Williams, and then later on, so-called beautiful performers according to common standards like Taylor Swift, who is a crossover artist. And so country grows out of that tradition. All right, now let's talk about format radio, which is what we have today. Almost every radio station is formatted very tightly, meaning it doesn't do rock and roll and blues and jazz. No, that's not going to happen unless it's a college radio station like WESS. And many of you, if you are interested in music, I strongly urge you to have your own radio show at WESS. It's the most fun you could possibly imagine having if you like music. You get to sit and listen to music and commentate on it, and other people are listening to it. I have a Rolling Stones hour. I've been doing it for 30 years. And I'll be finishing that up shortly before I retire, and be sad about it as well. So think about that. If you're interested in joining WESS Radio, just let me know. But we have many formats out there today, including music formats. We have album-oriented rock. We have CHR, known as Contemporary Hit Radio. We have country radio. We have Hot AC, which is Hot Adult Contemporary. There's a lot of versions, but each of these formats is going towards a specific audience, like females 18 to 35, for example, or males 45 to 54. That's what those are all about. We also have talk radio as a format, and then we also have public radio. So we haven't said much about public radio. It doesn't have a lot of visibility in the United States, but we do have NPR, National Public Radio. That's public radio, and was all made possible because in 1967, the government passed the Public Broadcasting Act. And the Public Broadcasting Act took aside a part of the FM band from 88 to 92 FM and said only non-commercial stations can be on that band. And then it also did the same for television, establishing public broadcasting television. So we've been through a lot of changes in the radio industry. We've been through, I discussed earlier, that the gramophone we talked about, but we eventually had the invention of the LP, which is vinyl, which many college students have returned to today. The people who listen to vinyl say you just can't get the same sound. It's not as full, it's not as deep as on vinyl. As you can't get it as good as you can on vinyl. You can't get it from digital recordings, like listening on Spotify and whatnot. So we do have the LP. That was a long play. That's what that stands for, long play. You probably have 5 songs on each side. The whole album's lasting about 40 minutes. And then came the 45, which is a small vinyl and just had one song on one side, one song on the other. It was used in jukeboxes. Later we get the CD, and then finally we end up with the MP3, which is how most music is recorded today, and that's why music can be stored in clouds and distributed on Spotify and Pandora and all the other places, iTunes, that you can get music from. So within the industry growing up, though, in the 1980s, radio consolidated. It consolidated because of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which allowed fewer companies to own more radio stations. So today, radio, just like many other businesses that we have already talked about in this class and will continue to talk about, is controlled by just a handful of a few companies, the biggest one being the Clear Channel Company. And as an example, the Clear Channel Company, or what you might know better as iHeartMedia, they own 4 radio stations in the Lehigh Valley. They've got WAEB, a talk station. They've got B104, an adult contemporary station. They've got Z10, I can't remember the Zoo. What is that? That 95.3, I think it is. That's a rock station, and then they've got another station that escapes me at the moment. So now when we head into the very end of our instructor video now, we want to try and take a look at the future of radio. It's always hard to do. If anybody could predict the future of mass communication technology, they would automatically be, they'd be clairvoyant, and they would also be rich. What we do know is that AM will continue to have limited value. AM does not transmit music or sound, for that matter, with as high fidelity as FM. That's why if you want to listen to talk radio, almost always it's going to be on AM, because talk doesn't need to have high fidelity, but music does. So we know that AM will continue to struggle. We know that FM will continue to be the band of choice that people listen to, but we also know that satellite radio continues to be a force in the radio landscape, although many people, they take out those Sirius satellite subscriptions for free, and then they don't renew them because nobody wants to pay $12 or whatever it is for radio. And then, of course, streaming. We know that streaming is going to continue to exist. I found that El Macambo album very easily on YouTube, and so many people can do that today, and actually performers have had a very tough time of that in collecting royalties because so much music can be pirated and then redistributed for free and illegally because digital technology allows you to do that. And by the way, you are allowed, we'll discuss this later in the class when we get to law, you are allowed to download 1 copy of a song legally for personal use. So that is not illegal. So we know that podcasting and streaming is going to play an important role in the future of music. Podcasting is something that many students are taking up. You can do it both with video and you can do it with radio. A podcast is basically a series of radio programs that are recorded that you can retrieve because they have been archived, and they usually occur in a series. So this is where radio is probably headed, but that's really up to you because you are the radio listeners or the audio listeners of the future. Have a great day.